Billions of dollars were on the table. None of it was going to the WTA. These brands weren't simply pursuing Alex. They were bypassing the entire tour to get to her. Think about that for a second. A 19-year-old from the Philippines had become more commercially valuable to major corporations than a professional circuit that's been running for over 5 decades. Not because she'd won a Grand Slam, not because she sat at the top of the rankings, but because of something the establishment genuinely doesn't know how to contain: raw, unscripted cultural magnetism. And when the dollar figures started leaking out of those private meetings, the tennis world didn't just raise an eyebrow, it held its breath, because this wasn't a sponsorship story. This was a power shift, a quiet corporate revolution happening in plain sight, dressed in a tennis skirt. And the WTA never saw it coming. Stay with me, because by the time we get to the end of this, you'll understand why the most important fight in women's tennis right now isn't happening on any court. There's a specific kind of athlete who outgrows their sport before the sport even realizes it's happening. Muhammad Ali did it. Serena Williams did it. And now, whether the WTA is ready or not, Alex is doing it. Her influence is already reaching corporate boardrooms from Manila to Manhattan, forcing marketing teams to tear up strategies they've relied on for years. She was born in the Philippines, shaped by intense discipline, and trained at the Rafael Nadal Academy in Mallorca. But what Alex brought into professional tennis couldn't be taught in any academy. She arrived with a story, a genuine, cross-continental, multi-generational story that resonated with billions of people across Southeast Asia, Europe, and North America all at once. That combination, the underdog geography, the elite European training pedigree, the infectious personality, produced what marketing executives quietly call a cultural convergence. And the brands noticed long before the rankings caught up. By the time Alex was making noise on the WTA tour, her social media following had already surpassed players ranked well above her. Her Instagram engagement numbers weren't just impressive for a tennis player. They were extraordinary for any athlete, in any sport, anywhere on earth. Brands that measure real audience connection, not follower counts, but actual emotional investment from real communities, were looking at her data and asking their analysts to run it again. Sportswear companies, luxury watchmakers, tech giants, telecoms with massive Southeast Asian consumer bases. They weren't just interested, they were quietly competing, and the conversations escalated from exploratory talks to serious financial commitments faster than anyone anticipated. Here's what made it significant. Those conversations weren't going through WTA partnership channels. They were going directly to Alex's representation. That distinction matters enormously. The WTA operates on a traditional sports marketing model: centralized sponsorships, official tour partnerships, revenue structures built around the collective. That model worked well for decades, but it was designed for a different era. An era before a single athlete could command more digital attention than the entire organization promoting her. Alex represented something the old model simply hadn't accounted for. A player whose individual brand gravity was pulling sponsors out of the tour's orbit, not through conflict, not through protest, just by existing and connecting with audiences on a frequency the WTA's institutional voice couldn't match. Inside tennis circles, the murmurs were multiplying. Agents representing other players were hearing from brand contacts that budget allocations were being reviewed. Tournament sponsors were getting quieter responses when they pitched renewal conversations. The money wasn't disappearing from women's tennis. It was consolidating, moving toward a single cultural center of gravity. That center had a name. That center had a backhand that could stop a conversation cold. And that center was just getting started. Ask yourself, when was the last time a teenager made billion-dollar corporations fundamentally rethink their entire sports marketing strategy? Because that moment had already arrived. Numbers have a way of escaping the rooms where they're born. The figures circulating in private conversations around Alex's sponsorship portfolio weren't standard mid-tier endorsement deals. The kind of arrangements most players outside the top 10 typically attract. What was being passed around in early term sheets represented a level of financial commitment usually reserved for established Grand Slam champions. Reports from sports business circles suggested that individual brand offers, when combined across multiple partnerships and projected over multi-year commitments, pointed to a total portfolio value measured not in millions, but in billions. A major telecom with deep roots across Southeast Asian markets was reportedly among the frontrunners. Several major sportswear companies, recognizing the cultural footprint she commanded across a large and rapidly growing consumer demographic, entered serious discussions. Technology brands searching for authentic ambassador voices in emerging markets saw her as irreplaceable. But what made these deals genuinely different wasn't the scale, it was the structure. Brands weren't asking how she fit into existing WTA-adjacent partnership frameworks. They were building entirely bespoke arrangements, creative partnerships, equity stakes, long-form content ventures, ambassador architectures that treated her not as an athlete endorser, but as a media entity. One sports marketing analyst put it with striking directness. Brands had essentially concluded that the emotional connection Alex had built with her audience was more efficiently accessed by going around the tour than through it. For the WTA, that conclusion carried devastating financial implications. When companies redirect sponsorship dollars away from organizational partnerships toward individual athlete deals that exist outside tour structures, the collective loses leverage. Other players lose visibility. Smaller tournaments lose revenue streams. The entire ecosystem absorbs the impact. And here's the layer that really intensified the tension. Alex wasn't engineering any of this. She wasn't positioning herself adversarially against the institution. Her team was simply responding to extraordinary market demand with sound commercial strategy. That's not rebellion. That's business. But the consequences for the WTA were real regardless of intent. Behind closed doors, tour executives were having difficult conversations. How do you maintain sponsorship relevance when one of your own members has become a more compelling individual investment than the collective platform she plays on? How do you rebuild commercial frameworks designed for a pre-social media world to accommodate an athlete whose personal audience dwarfs your institutional reach? These weren't hypothetical questions anymore. They required immediate answers, and the WTA, for reasons that will eventually become very public, appeared to be searching for those answers far too slowly. The billion-dollar question wasn't whether Alex deserved these offers. Nobody seriously disputed that. The question tearing through tennis boardrooms was much more unsettling. Had the WTA already lost control of the commercial narrative? And if so, could they ever truly get it back? Silence during a moment of systemic crisis is never actually silent. It communicates. While the brand negotiations around Alex were intensifying, and sports business media was beginning to connect the dots publicly, the WTA's official communication channels went conspicuously quiet. No formal acknowledgement, no strategic positioning statement, no visible effort to reframe the commercial story on their own terms. Just institutional stillness at precisely the moment decisive action was most necessary. And that silence was devastating. In today's media environment, an organization that can't control its own narrative doesn't just create a vacuum. It hands the microphone to everyone else. Tennis journalists, sports marketing analysts, fan communities across multiple continents, rival sports organizations, all of them rushed to fill the interpretive space the WTA left open. The story being built in their absence wasn't generous. It painted a governing body caught completely flat-footed by a transition that, in hindsight, had been visible for years. The structural reasons for the slow response were complicated. The WTA operates across multiple jurisdictions, balancing competing interests from players, tournaments, broadcasters, and long-standing corporate partners simultaneously. Deliberate decision-making is normally a sign of responsible governance, but the circumstances surrounding Alex's commercial explosion were anything but normal. Speed was essential. Adaptation was urgent, and speed wasn't arriving. Meanwhile, individual sponsors growing uneasy with the WTA's strategic direction began asking questions that would have been unthinkable months earlier. Brands that had maintained stable, mutually beneficial tour partnerships for years were suddenly revisiting the fundamentals. Were WTA-adjacent placements still reaching the audiences they needed most? Or had those audiences migrated, following specific athletes, distinct cultural moments, experiences that existed entirely outside institutional channels. The answers those brands were finding internally were deeply uncomfortable for tour leadership. Digital analytics don't negotiate. Audience migration data doesn't respect historic relationships. And the overwhelming finding across independent commercial assessments was consistent. The WTA's ability to deliver certain high-value audience segments had weakened considerably, while Alex's separate platforms had simultaneously grown stronger. Players across the tour were starting to feel the downstream effects. Brand conversations were shifting. Representatives who once mentioned WTA partnership alignment as a positive signal were now raising it less frequently, or framing it with qualifications that hadn't appeared before. The institutional endorsement that once amplified individual player commercial value was losing some of its pull. Veteran players, speaking anonymously to sports journalists, expressed genuine frustration. They had invested entire careers building the WTA's collective commercial reputation. The idea that institutional silence during a pivotal moment was quietly eroding years of collective effort felt, to many of them, like a profound failure of leadership. And still, officially nothing. When corporations begin quietly restructuring financial commitments, the language they use is never blunt. It's always softer. Strategic reallocation, portfolio reassessment, shifting investment priorities. But beneath the careful vocabulary, the meaning is identical. The money is moving. And in women's tennis, it began moving with alarming speed. The departures didn't announce themselves dramatically. That's never how institutional sponsorship erosion works. It happens through renewal conversations that don't reach conclusions, through option clauses that expire without activation, through partnership agreements that simply aren't extended with the enthusiasm or at the financial levels they once commanded. Gradually, then suddenly, multiple brands with established WTA presence began redirecting meaningful portions of their sports marketing budgets toward individual athlete partnerships outside tour structures. The logic was straightforward, and from a purely commercial standpoint, entirely rational. Audience engagement metrics around specific players, Alex being the most dramatic example, but not the only one, consistently outperformed tour-wide placement data. For brands optimizing every dollar against measurable audience response, the math wasn't complicated. The tournament ecosystem felt it immediately. Smaller WTA events, which depend far more heavily on sponsorship revenue than broadcast income, began operating under tighter financial constraints. Prize fund discussions became fraught. The operational infrastructure sustaining hundreds of players across the professional circuit, athletes who would never command individual billion-dollar portfolios, but who form the competitive backbone that makes elite tennis possible, started experiencing real strain. This dimension of the fallout rarely made headlines. The dominant narrative focused on Alex's extraordinary commercial ascent. The quieter, more significant story was what her gravitational commercial pull was costing the athletes who would never directly benefit from it. A mid-ranked player competing in second-tier WTA tournaments receives nothing from Alex's sponsorship negotiations, but she loses something if those negotiations divert funding away from the collective infrastructure sustaining her career. Several respected voices in the tennis community began addressing this publicly. The conversation wasn't framed antagonistically toward Alex. Virtually everyone acknowledged the situation wasn't her creation or her responsibility. The frustration was directed at structural failures within the sports marketing architecture and at organizational leadership seen as insufficiently equipped to adapt. Sports economists studying the situation noted a troubling parallel with dynamics that had already destabilized other professional sports leagues. When individual athlete commercial value massively outpaces institutional brand equity, revenue distribution within the sport becomes severely imbalanced. Athletes with enormous individual profiles capture disproportionate value. Everyone else faces escalating economic uncertainty. The competitive middle of the field, which is essential for any sport's long-term health, becomes financially fragile. Addressing that dynamic required immediate, intelligent structural innovation from the WTA. The organization needed commercial frameworks capable of recognizing and accommodating exceptional individual athlete value while preserving meaningful collective revenue streams. Whether that capacity existed within current leadership was a question The sponsorship exodus was answering loudly. The departures were never really about Alex. They were a verdict on whether the WTA had evolved quickly enough to remain commercially essential in a transformed media landscape. At this specific moment, that verdict was sharp and unambiguous. Now all eyes turned to one interview, and what happened next nobody predicted. There are moments in sports when an athlete says something so precise, so unexpectedly honest, that it cuts through every layer of institutional narrative and lands directly in the public consciousness like a perfectly placed winner down the line. Alex delivered that moment, and the internet didn't just respond, it detonated. In an interview that spread across platforms with remarkable speed, Alex addressed the business reality surrounding her career with a directness that caught nearly everyone off guard. She wasn't hostile, she wasn't performing grievance or manufacturing conflict. Her tone was measured and thoughtful, and somehow that calm made every word land harder than any emotional outburst could have. She spoke about representing something larger than individual achievement, about understanding that her visibility carried obligation to Filipino fans, to young women across Southeast Asia, to everyone who saw themselves reflected in her journey, about exploring commercial opportunities in ways that honored that responsibility, while also demanding that her value, her real cultural currency, be recognized on terms that actually reflected reality. And then she said something that stopped the entire conversation. Without bitterness, but with absolute clarity, she acknowledged that the structures around professional women's tennis hadn't been built with athletes like her in mind. Athletes whose commercial appeal derived primarily from cross-cultural resonance rather than ranking performance alone. Athletes whose audience relationships existed independently of any institutional framework. Athletes who, simply by existing authentically, challenged assumptions about how value gets measured and distributed in professional sports. Those words traveled everywhere at once. Sports media amplified them within hours. Marketing industry publications dissected them with genuine fascination. Fan communities across Southeast Asia erupted with fierce pride and emotional recognition. Tennis fans worldwide fell into sprawling debates about structural fairness, commercial equity, and institutional accountability. The conversation generated millions of interactions across every major platform. What made the moment so powerful wasn't its confrontational quality. It was the deep reasonableness of what Alex was expressing. Nobody listening could dismiss her perspective as naive or self-serving. The structural observations she articulated were accurate, well-documented, and reflected concerns that players, analysts, and sports economists had been discussing privately for years. Hearing a 19-year-old at the center of the storm explain all of it with that kind of quiet precision was genuinely remarkable. The WTA's response, characteristically, came late. When official statements finally appeared, they read as defensive rather than reflective. Measured observers noted that a genuinely confident organization would have engaged Alex's perspective with intellectual seriousness rather than institutional deflection. The contrast between her composure and the organization's awkward positioning only deepened public sympathy in her direction. Fan communities, particularly across the Philippines and wider Southeast Asia, transformed the moment into a cultural landmark. Clips from the interview accumulated hundreds of millions of views. Hashtags surrounding her name dominated trending conversations across multiple platforms for consecutive days. International outlets that rarely covered women's tennis were suddenly running major feature stories. Through all of it, Alex remained composed, gracious, focused on tennis, while the commercial and institutional world around her continued to reorganize in her direction. That composure, perhaps more than any specific statement, revealed something fundamental about her character, and it made her exponentially more desirable to the brands already chasing her with extraordinary financial commitment.